Welcome to this third session on artificial intelligence and the evolutionary explanation of religion. You have the program, received the program, so we will follow this program. And I would like, as a short introduction, summarize the preceding sessions. In the preceding two meetings, we have seen how Harari sharply describes and supports the mentality that humankind does not deserve any special dignity. He states the ongoing transformations in human consciousness and identity are so fundamental that they will call the very term human into question. So this is sort of attack to supersede and abolish humankind and make the term human nonsensical. And this attack is running on two fronts, blurring the difference between humankind and other animal species, and reducing human beings to a sort of artificial intelligence package of algorithms. As a possible way to defend the uniqueness and worth of humanity, we are suggesting the possible interest of two ideas. Humankind is in the image of God, called and ordered to share in God's love and reach eternal life. This was stressed in the last meeting. And to make this possible, God became a human being. These two ideas are certainly principles of the Bible and Christianity, but they are more. They are likely the strongest defense of humanity, and in this sense, part of a universal revelation, a content of divine origin hidden in the philosophical truth about humankind. In this meeting, we will focus on the first front of this attack and the stress that humanity is considerably more than just a genetic and biological criterion. And, and we will try to ascertain at which moment in history the biological species Homo sapiens became the biblical humankind in the image of God. As discussed in the preceding meetings, Robin Dunbar claims that the centerpiece of the Neolithic is the invention of mechanisms that allowed people to live together without killing each other. In the last meeting, a model was outlined to suggest that the creation of humankind, let's say Adam and Eve, in the image of God, took place in the Neolithic, and that the prohibition of murder in Genesis 9:3-6 recalls the mechanism Dunbar referred to. The aim of the present meeting is, on the one hand, to discuss models that date Adam and Eve long before the Neolithic. On the other hand, to discuss further arguments in favor of the thesis that Adam and Eve lived in the Neolithic, and in particular to show the relevance of the flood in this respect. This is the program, so we can already start with the presentation by Alfred. Please, Alfred, you can go.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction and good morning to everybody. Where do we come from? That's the question I would like to address. It's a big question, not easy, because there are so many disciplines involved. history, biology, philosophy, theology, perhaps a little bit. And here I try to find an answer. And I think one of the sources for this answer, let's see where I get the answer from, is from biology. That the last 20 years, large-scale DNA research became possible, and this made real, very important discoveries, which I would like to review a little bit. But before starting, I would like to come to the introduce a philosophical concept. That's a person. Because the difference between animals and human beings is that the latter are persons. Persons with more than material aspects in their being. And to show that we're dealing really with person, I will look for evolution and focus on the last 500,000 years, not before, but I think you need nearly all of this time to see what is going on in that time. It's real interesting what is going on there. When we speak about a human person, we have to ask us, what are the characteristics of a human person? It is more than biology, because a human person has intellectual capacities and, for example, has intuition, can contemplate and understand, it can communicate a person with abstract concepts. Also animals can communicate, but not with abstract concepts. Human being takes free decision, and the revision of that is that human being appreciates moral behavior, acknowledge laws. And second point, which I think is quite important, human being, a person, creates and appreciates art. And this picture what I show is that already in ancient Egyptian culture, but also the Greeks, there is awareness of an immortal soul in human person. And what I would make a statement that all modern, that means all now living people are persons, without any exception. And it's very clearly defined what is an animal and what is a human being. Looking for art, the art makes the invisible visible. And it's one of the questions which is really challenging. Why do we experience joy if we contemplate pictures? For example, these faces from very famous people and famous paintings. And I only came in mind the monkeys had a hit about 50 years ago, and then I saw her face. Now I am a believer, not a trace of doubt in my mind. I am in love, I am a believer. I couldn't leave her if I tried. It means the face has much more expression than like an animal would say that can eat or that cannot eat, or I can mate with this. But for human being, face is much more information. And that it's not that also expression of the invisible, which is inside a human being. Another, we have looked for art, but also mathematics. We see that there is something special with human beings. So in mathematics, you find two types of intellectual activity. So it's first a formalized logical approach, and the second is intuition, the mathematical insight, that we are able to discover meaning. And now we're going to the Turing machine. The best imaginable computer is based on a conventional processor, neural network, or quantum computers, doesn't matter, with infinite speed, infinite memories, etc. And the claim of Penrose is that even the Turing machine can carry out only type 1 activities. The type 2 activities is not possible for something which is based exclusively of the natural laws, of science and physical laws and biological possibilities. We find in higher animals, in artificial intelligence, in Turing machines, we find data processing, reasoning, use of algorithms. But in humans we discover more. And therefore, in human persons exceeds the realm of pure materiality. They exceed biology. Penrose states in his Emperor's New Mind, we must see the truth of a mathematical argument to be convinced of its validity. This seeing is the very essence of consciousness. It must be present whenever we directly perceive mathematical truths. When we convince ourselves of the validity of Gödel's theorem, we not only see it, but by doing so we reveal the very non-algorithmic nature of the seeing process itself. This was a little bit to clarify what is a person. Now we are coming to biology, because I told you that most of the argumentation comes from DNA research. We have the most important thing, what I would like is the DNA, we see at the right, and you find it in the nucleus, you have DNA, but also in the mitochondria, you find a little bit of DNA. And here we have in the nucleus, the DNA is formed in chromosomes, and chromosomes in spiral, and you find these things. And we have 2 times 23 chromosomes. 2 times 22 chromosomes are equal for male and female, and 2 chromosomes are different. So XY only with men, and XX only with women. That's important, we see later. If we now look more closely to the DNA, nuclear DNA, we find the chromosomes, but within the chromosomes we find genes. And the genes are built up of base pairs. And typically the gene has 1,000 to 1 million base pairs. And here you get more or less what you have, how many genes you have, how many base pairs. At least humans, about 3 billion base pairs. You can calculate how many possibilities to transmit information. It's incredible. See 6 chromosomes, and they are important. So we have here, we see a picture gives the X chromosome and the Y chromosome, the small one. And the Y chromosome you will find only with man. It's transmitted from father to son. Then you have the mitochondrial DNA, which is transmitted from the mother to the offspring, to son and daughter. We'll see that it's very important for making the genetic tree if we use these Y chromosomes and the mitochondrial DNA. Now, the human genome has been explored about 20 years ago, and we have 3 billion base pairs per genome, and about 1,000 of the base pairs are different among now living people. So that means we have an average about 3 million difference of these base pairs, position of the base pair. So it's quite a large number, but it's still very tiny differences. Only one out of thousands. How is genetic transformation proceeds from parents to children? Here, each child inherits a copy of the genome from the father and also from the mother. And these are in turn mosaic of pieces from the grandfather and grandmother. That is called recombination. That means we get the complete information of father and father and mother, but before dividing, then we see that it's because otherwise information would accumulate. But the information, the genetic information does not accumulate, so you have to skip a part of it. So you get a mosaic of father and mother, but not the complete set. By this recombination, that's one of the ways where the genetics changes by each generation, but you have also mutations. And the mutations and the recombinations, these are the two types we have for changes. And the changes per generations are relatively small. Mutations about 70 base pairs, one of the 3 billions, and recombination about 36 events, are not so many. And if you go then further, we come to a molecular clock. That is now very important, that you can do historic research just by looking at the DNA of living persons or old persons, of even animals which already have been extinct. Because what you're doing is counting the mutations and or as an alternative you can go for the changes due to the recombination. And then just by counting, and you know how many changes you expect per generation, you can say that the most recent common ancestor has lived so much years before. And here is an example that from such a genetic tree, it was splitting about, let's see, 8-9 million years ago between animal chimps and humans. And then you have a splitting of the Neanderthals about 500,000 years ago. But then you have recently interbreeding. That means last 100,000 years or 50,000 years. And it's clear that the Neanderthals don't continue up to 0 time now because they are extinct about 30, 40,000 years ago. Now we come to a very important study of the DNA and of humans and Neanderthals. We have DNA from Neanderthals. It's very important that we can also see how this is. We find that here you see the dots. These are fossils which have been found and where you could also extract DNA. What you see here is the let's see the it's a human. Let's see, the Homo sapiens more or less is splitting in a branch what became Homo sapiens sapiens and Neanderthals Denisovans. So it's about 500, 600,000 years ago, and you get split here. You find gene transfer from here archaic humans to Neanderthal. What does it mean, gene transfer? That means you have intercourse between species of Neanderthals and humans with fertile offspring. And then the genes of the parents came in the pool of the Neanderthals here. The other way around, you find quite some gene transfer from Neanderthals and Denisovan to humans. What is very interesting, this transfer is to Papuan, to French people, that means for European people, for Han people, it's in China, but not people in Africa. Why not? It's clear. By fossil, we know that there are no Neanderthals in Africa. Therefore, there couldn't be any gene transfer there. This is an important transfer, the only one we see from the archaic humans to Neanderthals. The other way is only one side around, not the other way around. Why is that? We come later on to that. There's another recent study. You see that the left is already known, but since the right one, that it's from Petra et al. From 2020. And so he studied more in detail this part from the archaic human to Neanderthal. And what he sees is that there's gene transfer, and for one reason or another, we don't know, the offspring of these archaic humans replace totally the Neanderthals. So we are left, in fact, that the recent Neanderthals, let's see, the one last 100 or 200,000 years, in fact, archaic humans. They are not the Neanderthals, the old Neanderthals, which split it around here. You see about 700,000 years ago. Now, what we see is an evolution from hominins to Homo sapiens. Fossils and DNA gives a coherent picture. And then something very, very important, there is biologically no discontinuity. That means if you look for the DNA, we don't see a jump, something special happening with when come Homo sapiens or the human person. There's no discontinuity. And here gives some numbers in comparison. We have, let's see, the difference in DNA between the now living Homo sapiens. Sapiens is about 0.1%. The difference with the Neanderthal is 0.3%. So it's quite closely, and therefore you can explain why there is fertile offspring. And to chimp and gorilla, it's beyond 1%, 1.2 and 1.6%. Then it's something important that you can make a genetic family tree with the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. Why is that so attractive? It is because if you use this part of the chromosomes, then you don't have recombination, because you receive mitochondrial DNA only from the mother and Y chromosomes only from the father. You get the complete set of the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial DNA. The only changes you have is mutations, but no recombination. So you can much more exactly determine. The puzzle is less complicated than if you would have recombination. And then you find in two recent studies why Adam, I call him Adam, but you can say it's the most common, the most recent common ancestor in the patrilineal line is about 250 years ago, and mitochondrial Eve is about 200,000 years ago. And the important thing in the mitochondrial DNA, there is no genetic material from Neanderthal and other hominins. It's astonishing, because in the rest of the DNA there's quite some material from others, from Neanderthal and Denisovans, but not in the mitochondrial DNA. The Martina Betkova in let's see, it's not real science, it's popular science, comments a little bit about this study of what they had before of, well, let's see, Shan et al. In 2019. She comments, she is our most recent common female ancestor. The woman whose mitochondrial DNA has been passed down thousands of generations and currently can be found in every single human being on Earth. She wasn't the first woman. She was, however, the woman whose DNA line has not gone extinct. That is what biology is telling. And also you can localize, after studying about 1,200 indigenous tribes in Southern Africa, scientists, that it's Shan et al. And Nature paper, confirmed that the Kusam people descend from people who split off from the main Homo sapiens branch around 100,000 years ago. This means their DNA did not intermix as much as the rest of us. Their genes contain higher amounts of mitochondrial Eve's DNA. This places her squarely in the Makgadikari Pan, that's in Botswana. Now I am leaving for a short moment biology and going to Genesis. Of course, you can consider Genesis as a word of God, as the Bible is, but I would like it's more that we consider it as an old book which has been, it's kind of a memory which has gone quite far away down in the past. And the statements we can look and they're quite interesting. in that for ourselves, even if we wouldn't accept it as a word of God. The first one is, God created man in the image of himself. The image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. That could be a statement, there's something different in human beings. They are persons. It says more than that, but it includes that. And then comes a comment which is very important. The man said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She is to be called woman because she was from man. And why is that important? Adam, we read, he had seen all the animals, I would say, including your Homo sapiens animal, and see, that's not bone from my bone and flesh of my flesh. And then he sees Eve and says, yes, that it is. He recognized as quite different from all the others. That means the Homo sapiens person from the very beginning is aware that he is a person, is somebody different. And then another comment, the man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all those who live. Eve is the mother of all who live, not Adam is the father of all who is living. Why only this asymmetry in this observation? And in Genesis 9:6, there's a repetition that it's after the flood, for in the image of God was man created. Now we're going. We come now to the, we compare mitochondrial DNA and Eve of Genesis. It says first, Genesis Eve was a person belonging to Homo sapiens, and present-day living Homo sapiens are persons. Biologically, genetically, there is continuity between Homo sapiens before mitochondrial Eve and present-day persons. And also, like with Genesis Eve, all present-day living persons on Earth are direct offspring of mitochondrial DNA, as well as Genesis Eve. We find that there's some coincidence, which is a very, very strong fact. When this was studied first time about 20, 30 years ago, the paper had 40 revisions when included that there is this coincidence between Eve, Genesis Eve and mitochondrial Eve. And now what it's, I would like to show, is there evidence that mitochondrial DNA was a person and not just an animal? Here's some facts. All descendants of Homo sapiens women contemporary to mitochondrial DNA Eve are extinguished. Why? All descendants of female hominins are distinguished, with the exception of direct antecessors of mitochondrial DNA Eve. So it means nothing is left of all the other hominins which we had before. Only mitochondrial survived. Then there's genetic materials, Neanderthal and Denisovans. I say Homo sapiens animal, not only Homo sapiens person. There's no genetic material of Neanderthal of Denisovans in the mitochondrial DNA of present-day persons. We don't see it in the mitochondria. And there's no genetic material of the descendants of mitochondrial Eve in the DNA of Neanderthals and Denisovans. That we have seen that the gene transfer is asymmetric with respect, it's going from humans to Neanderthals and not the other way around. I have to finish near late. And what I'm saying is the paradox that there appears in one assumes that mitochondrial DNA is conscient of being a person. Matrimony is only between persons. Rape of female descendants of Eve by hominins, Homo sapiens, animal, Neanderthal, Denisovans is possible, but the offspring of that union are persons. And the other way around, bestiality by a human person with hominin is less frequent, up to no no gene flow observed. I'm out my time. I have still to say something. What do you say, Antoine? What shall I do?
Yes,
Continue?
so go.
Okay,
So-
then I will say it's not so much left. I
But-
would only say that Ratzinger in 64 already imagines that something that was possible. That he says there's a difference between genetic monogenism and theological monogenism. He says that here it's written as a common, even then the possibility remains that ingenious lighting to think transcendence happened for the first time in one or two individuals. And the rest is genetics. But that within a group of Homo sapiens, a few were selected, Adam and Eve, to become persons. And here's a tentative how it could have been possible. We had this group of Homo sapiens. A few of them, that's about 200,000 years ago, a few of them, Adam and Eve, became persons. The offspring of Adam and Eve, of course, are persons, but also offspring of a unit where at least one person is a person. And then Homo sapiens departed from Africa, settled gradually in all parts of the world, and that started about 130,000 years ago. That's out of Africa here, which is also quite confirmed by fossils. And then work of art is found in all continents, dating back up to 40 kilo years ago. And this, I think, I would like to show, that is a work of a human being, a person depicting a whole human person. That's found in France, and is an ivory carving from a mammoth tooth, because elephants they are not in France, but mammoths, yes. And it's about 25,000 years ago. I think let's see, I told you, art is quite important to make visible the invisible. And here you see that is not depicted an animal, and the work is not made by an animal. Thanks, I would like to give especially you see, read some names, but Julian Shins, who has brought me to this idea of mitochondrial Eve and this asymmetry, etc.
So thank you very much for this really stimulating presentation, Alfred. Now, Jan David, please, then can you go ahead, and then we will come back to this.
Yes, thank you, Alfred. It was very interesting. I think my presentation could complete a little bit your presentation with paleontological proofs of the emergence of consciousness of human beings. I have chosen to take burials at the Discerning Criterion. Criterion to decide when there is a human being and not an animal anymore. So my presentation is based largely of the presentation of Nicolas Perrault in Netherhall 6 years ago. Okay. The point is which criteria we can choose to determine when a hominid is a human being. If you take writing, everybody agrees that when you can write, you are a human being. But I mean, you have a lot of indigenous Australian or a lot of indigenous people who cannot write. So I mean, the writing is maybe not the best criterion to determine if there is a man. If you take tools, you have a lot of animals using tools, even birds, to take out a worm from a branch, for example. If you take, but making tools, you see that the apes, like chimps, are able to make spear from branches For example, for killing small animals like monkeys and eat them. So making tools is not the best, the criteria to distinguish between animals and men. Of course, men are more gifted making tools, but we are looking for something very different, a difference of nature, not of degree. If you take agriculture, even agriculture, you have ants milk some little insects called aphids. So agriculture is maybe not the criteria, the criterion. But if you see ritual burials, we will explain a little better what is a ritual burial. So a burial with a rite, with goods. Ritual burial seems to be something very typical for human. We'll explain why. And Alfred speak a little bit about it. Art, representative art could be a good criterion to explain the emergence of humans. And the question is, when is the first ritual burial and the first art? So, while ritual burial could be the proof that some hominids are made at the image of God, it's a philosophical question, because from a philosophical point of view, man's characteristic is to be able to refer to entities outside his world. So you have the emergence of religion, you can refer to deities, you can conceive the idea of God. If somebody is an atheist, it's a proof that is human, but because animals are not atheists, I never are atheist, but an atheist, if you are an atheist, it means you conceive the idea of God. And of course, as well, the belief in a life after death could be another criterion. And of course, if you have a ritual burial, you have a sign or a proof of a belief in life after death. If what we can call generally the capacity of transcendence. Humans have the capacity of transcendence, animals don't. So but now with burials we have a problem, because there are many reasons to bury a dead person which do not indicate a capacity of transcendence. Firstly, all skeletal remains are buried. It's not a burial, they are buried naturally because of the passage of time. And you have to analyze it to see, but if somebody dig before, or it was only the time, then okay, burials could be a mean of avoiding the smell of decomposition of the body. Even if you speak about sign of remembrance, it's not sure that a sign of remembrance, if you do a hill, to have a sign of remembrance of your dead ancestors, it's not clear that it is a sign of transcendence. For example, elephants smell the bones of their ancestors, and for them it's a sign of remembrance. So, but with a sign of remembrance, you stay in your world. So you are not referring to entities outside your world. A burial can be as well a place of death execution, which is not a sign of transcendence, but when there are ritual elements, it is a sign that there is a belief that there is something more than an animal. Then I have chosen three interesting terms to see when appears the first sign of transcendence in the history, in the prehistory. And so the first ritual burial ever could be the pit of bones, Cima de los Huesos, or in Spanish, near Burgos. And it's interesting because the bodies, there are the remains of 28 bodies, were dumped there shortly after their death. There is no sign of cannibalism, so it's not the remains of meals, and they were not dumped there to kill them, so there is not death execution. So the best hypothesis is that was a ritual. Above all, because they have found there a beautiful unused bee face, and it is unused, and it is very costly. It's a very costly artifact for this period, and could be a gift to the dead person there. But I mean, this first ritual burial is not very clear. You are to do a complicated interpretation. We are not sure it was already a ritual. To complete was the presentation of Alfred. It's interesting because we found there the oldest DNA which was analyzed. The DNA there from a tooth is the mitochondrial DNA belongs to a Denisovian man, but the nuclear DNA belongs to an early Neanderthals man. Okay, interesting. But it's not the work of Homo sapiens. Then the problem is what would be the first the first ritual burial recognized as such for the specialist, by the specialist. But it is near Nazareth, almost 100,000 years ago. And it's clearly a ritual burial because the 15 bodies there are painted with red ochre, and they have deer horns, deer antlers in their hands. I have a small movie. I think I have to share the. Yeah, okay, I do it. The audio.
The third site, Kavaza Cave in Mount Precipice in Israel, dates back to roughly 92,000 BC. In the cave, there were 15 skeletal remains of 7 adults and 8 children, of very early archaic Homo sapiens. Additional items at the site included flint tools, seashells, and lumps of red clay called red ochre. There were major differences at the site that were not present in the previous 2. Firstly, 6 of the 15 remains were buried in an orderly fashion in the cave floor, and not just deposited wherever. 2 of the skeletons were buried with deer horns in their hands, adding an element of symbolism. Finally, the most striking and important feature was some bones were coated with the red ochre clay, possibly used as a religious or spiritual preparation for burial. The red ochre clay was also famously used in cave paintings, which are dated around 44,000 BC, some 48,000 years after this burial occurred. This discovery was groundbreaking, as it showed Homo sapiens as early as 92,000 BC were capable of abstract and symbolic thought when dealing with death. Later archaeological digs found that as time progressed from 92,000 BC to 25,000 BC, there was a substantial increase in use of red ochre and more elaborate symbolism in Paleolithic culture, such as cave paintings and Venus figurines.
Okay, very interesting because it's we are in the middle Paleolithic. It's difficult to say. There is no sign of transcendence when you see such a burial. Then the third burial I have chosen is this one. Is the first, we can call it elaborated, complex burial or costly burial. That is in Russia, it's Hungary. And it's very striking because for such a burial, you need a lot of hours of work. It's a very costly burial. And we can ask about why these people spent tens of thousands of hours of work to bury these two persons. And which is the most striking is that there is more goods for the child who was only 10 years old. So paleontologists make the hypothesis that for such a burial was very important to strengthen the link in the community. It was very important, so that you need a commitment of the whole community to make such a burial. And of course, it's as well a sign of transcendence. But for paleontologists, very important is that these burials were very important to strengthen the community and was an advantage for these people, for Homo sapiens versus Neanderthals for survival, because they commit themselves in very costly burials. And this burial is at the very beginning of the Upper Paleolithic period, so long before the Neolithic, clearly. Then, summing up, you have a first burial, which could be ritual, but it's a little bit an exception, and the interpretation is difficult, as in Atapuerca, and is the work of Neanderthals. Then the emergence of Homo sapiens here, more or less 200,000 years ago. We can discuss the date, but it's clearly after Atapuerca. Then the first ritual burial, as recognized as such, is in Nazareth in the Middle Paleolithic. But in this same period, which is quite a small period compared to the whole period of the Paleolithic, you have the first ritual burial, then you have the emergence of figurative art. The first one is the work of Homo sapiens in Indonesia. You have this pig below, which is 44,000 years ago. And then you have, at the end of Middle Paleolithic, beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, the first elaborated burial in Sangir. So you have more or less in the same period, you have an amount of proofs of transcendence, of that there is a human being. Now, let's see the discussion of the problems. The first problem is that interpreting these artifacts as a sense of transcendence is difficult or controversial. So you can always say, okay, it's not a sign of transcendence, it's only a ritual to regulate social life. As a matter of fact, paleontologists don't speak about capacity of transcendence. They speak of the importance of ritual for the social life. But it's not incompatible, of course. And when you see the tomb in Sangir, you have to admit that it's not only a sign of transcendence, there is more than that. There is these burials were very important for the social life of these people, who were very poor and spent a lot of time to prepare such a burial. Then, another problem is that there is an evolution in the complexity of tombs and artifacts. So the tomb in Nazareth, near Nazareth, is far simpler than the tomb in Sangir, clearly. But on the one hand, you have an evolution. On the other hand, from a biblical perspective, you don't become a man little by little. So you are created as a man, and God gave the soul to Adam and Eve, and So the change is sudden. How can you explain an evolution in the complexity of terms, and at the same time the Bible present the emergence of God, of the man as something sudden? So there is a problem if we tend to link intelligence to the capacity to conceive God. And I would like to stress that there is a mistake. It's not the same. Of course, if you have the capacity to conceive God, you have some intelligence. But the contrary is not true. You can be very intelligent without capacity to conceive God. And then a computer is very intelligent and doesn't have the capacity to conceive God. But it's the same for some animals. Chimps are very intelligent for hunting, or chimps are more gifted than man to remind figure on a screen. For example, there are more memory, and so on. So the intelligence is not, if you are very intelligent, it's not the proof you have the capacity to conceive God. A 7-year-old Homo sapien child has the capacity to conceive God, but maybe is less intelligent than a Denisovian adult. I don't know. So I would say it's a mistake to link both things. One thing is to have the capacity to conceive God, which is a sign of some intelligence, but that is not the intelligence. Then, a third problem. Some of the first burials are from Neanderthal men, and Neanderthal's graves are simple. They come later, but often with grave goods. Or, apart the exception of Atapuerca, Neanderthal's graves are later than Homo sapiens' graves. And we have the impression that Neanderthals learned from Homo sapiens how to bury their dead. In Neanderthal graves, you have never, how to say that in English, a jewelry. Never occur, but only, like in Atapuerca, grave goods, which is not clearly a sign of transcendence. Then, my proposal as conclusion. We lack the evidence to show that Neanderthals had a sense of transcendence. It could change, but for the moment, we don't have enough proofs. Taking a safety margin, we can assume that the first men are the Homo sapiens, I mean the first men with a capacity of transcendence. Interestingly, the first clearly ritual grave is the work of early Homo sapiens near Nazareth. Why do we have to wait until the Upper Paleolithic for elaborate paintings and tombs? In the early Paleolithic, you have an explosion of ritual burials, of paintings, and so. Why do we have to wait almost 200,000 years to have very elaborate artifacts? Because of the population size, we have to remind that there is a bottleneck for Homo sapiens 74,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens got almost extinct, reduced to 10,000 individuals. Then the northern hemisphere was very cold, which is difficult to build a complex society which could have social rights and so on. So complex culture develops only when population density is high. But another idea is the most recent common ancestor of an Englishman and an Australian indigenous would have lived over 100,000 years ago, if both display complex thought, their ancestor probably did too. So my proposal is that, according to the artifacts found so far, only Homo sapiens is human, and early Homo sapiens are already human because he is able to think outside his world. We have the proof of this burial near Nazareth. So it's far before the Neolithic. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Jean David. I see. Please, you can through the chat or raising hand to ask for a question. I see some. Please turn your camera on and make a nice face so that we can take some print screens for remember this really memorial seminar. So Sam, please.
I simply clapped for the presentation. There's the clap emoji. It wasn't raising my hands.
Ah, okay, well, excellent. Is someone wanting to ask a question?
Antoine, I have a question.
Okay, Alfred, please.
Yes, about from Jean David, he told about the bottleneck about 74,000 years ago. Can you explain a little bit more about that? What happened then?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So I'm not a specialist, but according to genetician, there were only 10,000 Homo sapiens in reproductive age per period, because maybe of the explosion of volcano.
Toba.
The Toba.
Toba, yes.
I don't know more, sorry, Alfred.
Yes. Well, I can complete this information. It seems that is a controversial proposal. So there are publications after the publication you refer to that question this result, only to say. So this bottleneck is not scientifically already well established. So
yes, I know, but it was only to stress my explanation that the population was
clear.
Only that.
Yeah. All right, Marco.
All right, I just have a question for Jean-David, just to recap the whole discussion, because in my understanding, the main point is the difference between a religious burial and a non-religious burial. I have understood that before 12,000 years ago, burials were just, and cemeteries were just places where corpses were stacked without any transcendental meaning, while at a certain point you have a religious burial, because we can deduce that it is religious and not just a magazine for corpses, because we have symbols and paintings and artifacts. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, it's all right. You have a lot of burials at the very beginning where Neanderthals deposited the body, for example, in a cave, and we don't understand why.
Okay.
Not any ritual. Like a little bit in Atapuerca, they they dumped the bodies there, and we don't understand why.
Okay.
But with Homo sapiens, you have the appearance of a ritual, the red ochre, for example.
Okay, Buko, please.
Okay, there were people before me, but two questions to Alfred, actually, just for my understanding. do we have full genomes from all this, all the human or humanoids that you mentioned?
As far as yes, as far as I can read these papers, I don't think that's a full genome, and only parts of it, but sufficient to draw certain conclusions. For example, mitochondrial DNA is very often can be found. So Y chromosome is much less conserved, but you can find it also, but with less thing. Then also what people are doing, they find fossils and they don't know, not only took the bones or remains, but what they're doing is they look at what the flora, what is there contained, and make an analysis. And they find DNA also from the humans there. So it's a complicated thing, and the complete genome, I don't think that we have available. At least what I can read these papers.
And the second question, if I might, if I understood you correctly, we are all offspring of this mitochondrial Eve. Is there a consensus in the research community about this?
Yes, it's quite a large consensus. I told you that it was already claimed 30 years ago about. And then there was not so much means, and this paper needed 40 revisions before being accepted. So there was quite a lot of discussion about that. But since that time, more and more of these things have been confirmed. And looking for the mitochondria, they make extended also now for animals. And it's a method which is very largely used and always confirming that directs to one person or one origin of this mitochondrial DNA.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. Then we are a bit late in time. We have to move with the presentation by Mark Fox. Please, Mark, can you share?
Okay.
Thank you.
You see that?
Yes.
Okay, so welcome. Sorry I haven't been here for the first part of the meeting. Anyway, I'm going to give you a few thoughts on Adam and Eve, according to C.S. Lewis. So first of all, I'd just like to, what's happened here? Sorry. Okay, so do I need a pointer? Can you see my mouse? Hello, do you see my mouse?
Yes,
we see.
Okay, good. Okay, so this, I believe, is the sort of traditional picture of what we understand from the Bible about Adam and Eve. At some point, God creates Adam and Eve, and then they have offspring. We know they had 3 sons, one of whom was killed. Anyway, it has 2. There's some women. We're not quite sure where they came from. Anyway, and then they proceed to beget the rest of the human race. And you think about this story and how it's told. Well, there's obviously a question you ask yourself is you've got incest going on here, right, left, and center. So I once discussed this with a friend of mine, and he said, well, of course, problem with incest is that it leads to handicap, mentally retarded children, blah, blah. You get genetic defects passed on. I said, well, of course, God will have created Adam and Eve genetically perfect. So this isn't going to be an issue until you get down to the 50th generation. Anyway, that's certainly what I kind of always thought. This is what the Bible seems to be saying to us. Now, just caught the end of those discussions about the fact that doing this genome sequencing, this picture does not seem to be compatible with what modern scientific methods are telling us. It seemed to be that there's always been a population of hominids that evolve out of lower chimps and other such animal-like species, that kind of family. But the minimum population size is always something like 10,000 or something like that. So there's never a case where you can just say there's just 2 humans on the planet and we are all descended from that couple simply, and there's nobody else around. And of course, this creates an issue for Christians, and we know there's this famous encyclical of Pope Pius XII, 1950, says faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him, as from their first parents of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. So this is interesting. This is coming in 1950, long before we knew any of this, but of course the evolutionary ideas were around. So then you say, well, how are we going to square this scientific data with our traditional belief that we are all descended from Adam? Okay, so various ways you might think about dealing with this. Once I got into a discussion with a rabbi, a traditional rabbi who definitely thinks that the world was created 6,000 years ago. And we sort of got on to this issue. I asked him, well, what about the dinosaur fossils and all this kind of thing? He basically, as far as I can see, he thinks that God is a trickster. So the specific example he gave is it created trees with tree rings in them. This presumably also means he messed up our DNA to look as if it came from this 10,000 species, 100,000 years ago, stuffed a few dinosaur bones in the ground to give us some fun, etc. So that's one approach. Now, another approach you can take, and I think this is quite a common one, is just say, well, it's just a story. There's no first parents, no original sin. And I do remember one of these previous meetings, the chap from the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, whose name I've forgotten, I'm afraid. But anyway, it's basically what he said. This is how he understands it. He says, well, I never really believed, that first parents. It's just saying we're all sinful and we all need redemption in Christ. It occurs to me there is a third way you can deal with this, and I certainly dealing with a number of very strong Christians, and they just say, well, I don't believe the science. The Bible's right, and so the science must be wrong. All that genome sequencing stuff. Well, what's the scientific certainty on it, etc. And anyway. I'm going to carry on and say assume this stuff is correct, and we're going to try and see how to reconcile this with the Bible and see where C.S. Lewis comes in. So anyway, this assuming we've got this large population of hominids here, and then at some point or other, God intervenes. I suppose we would say God puts an immortal soul into 2 of these hominids, and they then become Adam and Eve, and then they produce offspring, and these offspring are separate from the other hominids who gradually die off. So, of course, this doesn't solve the incest problem. You need large family sizes. And basically, the other problem with this is that if you work it out, the DNA diversity that we see in the present human race is far too great to be explained by this kind of process. So then you go to this other version of this, is that you start, the beginning is the same, but you have Adam and Eve living among these other hominids, and they are going to intermarry. So you have intermarriage between the children of Adam and Eve, the direct offspring. They will marry some of these other hominids, and then they gradually, the green ones, they're the ones who are directly descended from Adam and Eve. They're the ones with the immortal souls. These propagate down, and with time, the Homo sapiens completely takes over, and there's none of these lower forms left. They get killed off or die off, or however we do it. Anyway, this seems to be a model. Now, this would seem to be compatible with what would make us all children of Adam, and it's compatible with DNA diversity. The trouble is you need an awful long time for this to get to here. It seems with these discussions, what we've seen, it's 100,000 years ago. Is God going to leave the human race in the fallen state for 100,000 years? Well, we don't know, but anyway, it seems a long time. Okay, so by the way, I'll just throw this slide in, which seems to be Suarez's theory. But anyway, I'll let him explain this. But Antoine is certainly at previous meetings trying to expound this theory, which as far as I can see, you've got these hominids. God picks two of them, they fall. And at this point, God turns the whole lot, infuses immortal souls into everybody. So basically, this is the Suarez process. Let him comment on that. Right, now, anyway, I'll get on to C.S. Lewis in a minute. I just thought an interesting depiction of sort of Homo sapiens and lower hominids. You get it in this film, Planet of the Apes, which you may or may not have seen, 40 years old now. But anyway, you have Charlton Heston, who's clearly a fine example of Homo sapiens. And afraid we've got Nova here, who's a primitive hominid, can't speak and has primitive behavior. And obviously, Charlton falls in love with her, and presumably they go off and marry. I don't know. Anyway, so you do have this intermarriage of the Homo sapiens with these primitive hominids. So the interesting thing, of course, is you go back and you ask a question, as far as we know, Adam and Eve only had 3 offspring, Cain, Abel, and Seth. So where do the wives of Cain and Seth come from? And there is this, there is early on in Genesis, there does seem to be an implication that there are other people around. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. They bore children to them. So that you've got the sons of God and the daughters of men. So it does seem it's actually there in Genesis. Anyway, right, so where does Lewis come in? So some of you may know Lewis. You probably know him best from his books, The Chronicles of Narnia, which of course have been turned into films in recent years. He wrote a lot. He wrote, obviously, wrote novels, and he also wrote a lot of apologetic works. And certainly, I think some of them are very good and are definitely worth reading. Now, he seems to be goes into the sort of origins of man very early on in his career. Noticeably, you've got these 3 novels, the Cosmic Trilogy, which were written between 38 and 45. You've got The Problem of Pain, which is in 1942. And then we also have an interesting one, which I've discovered recently, which is a commentary on Paradise Lost. And I'm going to briefly see what he says in those 3. Now, the Cosmic Trilogy, if you've not read it, a very interesting set of novels. First of all, the hero, Ransom, goes to Mars and this is the first one, out of the Silent Planet. So there he discovers an advanced civilization, which has not fallen. So this is he's speculating what would have happened if Adam and Eve had not fallen. What would the population of the earth be like? And he's speculating like this. So they go there, and because the Silent Planet is basically, you have all the planets, populated planets of the solar system, and Earth is silent because it's been banished from all the others because it's under the power of the evil angel. So the other planets are all good. They don't want anything to do with Earth. Anyway, so it's speculating on what would have happened if there had not been a fall. Then you have Perelandra, or the Voyage to Venus. Now, at this point, they go to Venus, which has only very recently been populated. And at this point, God has created Adam and Eve, or the equivalent, on the planet Venus. And 2 spacemen from Earth go, the good one, Ransom, and the bad one, Weston. And basically, they are the ones who end up tempting Eve. And then final book is That Hideous Strength, which is set on Earth, where the Earth is being taken over by a bunch of evil scientists under the power of the devil. Anyway, these books here, they're sort of interesting. He's speculating what Adam and Eve would have been like if they hadn't fallen, and in particular what the fall was about. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But anyway, the book where it's perhaps most close to what relevance to this meeting is The Problem of Pain. This is written in 1940, because there's a lot of pain in 1940. There's a war on, people are getting killed, and he's trying to answer the age-old problem. How do you explain evil and pain in the world when there is, postulating a good God? Anyway, it goes through a number of arguments, and in the middle of which it discusses the origin of man and the fall into rebelliousness. This is chapter 5 of The Problem of Pain. So these are a couple of quotes from those chapters. It says, for long centuries, God perfected the animal from which was to become the vehicle of humanity in the image of himself. So this is developing these cavemen, but they aren't Homo sapiens. They are not sons of God. They are just very, very advanced hominids, developed from evolutionary process, from some lower form of chimpanzee-like being. And he gave it hands whose thumbs could be applied to each of the fingers, and jaws and teeth, and a throat capable of articulation, and a brain sufficiently complex to execute all the material motions whereby rational thought is incarnated. Okay, so this is a very, very advanced chimpanzee, basically, is what we're speculating here, Neanderthal or something like that. This creature may have existed in this stage for ages before it became man, may even have been clever enough to make things which a clever archaeologist would accept as proof of its humanity. So, cave paintings 35,000 years ago, evidence of tools, all these kind of things. Well, Lewis is saying, well, we could say that's proof that this is a human being, Homo sapiens, son of God. But he's saying, well, not necessarily. But it was only an animal because all its physical and psychical processes were directed to purely material and natural ends. Okay. Then, in the fullness of time, God caused to descend upon this organism, both on its psychology and physiology, a new kind of consciousness, which would say I and me, so self-conscious, look upon itself as an object which God knew God, make judgments of truth, beauty, and goodness, which was so far above time that he could perceive time flowing past. Judged by his artifacts, or even by his language, this blessed creature was no doubt a savage. All that experience and practice can teach, he had still to learn. He chipped flints, he doubtless chipped them clumsily enough, maybe utterly incapable of expressing in conceptual form his paradisal experience. I do not doubt that if paradisal man could now appear among us, we should regard him as an utter savage, a creature to be exploited, at best patronized. Only one or two, and those the holiest among us, would glance a second time at the naked, shaggy-bearded, slow-spoken creature, but they, after a few minutes, would fall at his feet. Anyway, of course, we then had the fall. Someone whispered they could become as gods. The human spirit had been in full control of human, but its authority over the organism was a delegated authority, which lost, and it ceased to be God's delegate. And organs no longer governed by man's will fell under the control of ordinary biochemical laws and suffered the interworkings of those laws might bring about in the way of pain, senility, and death. So that's Problem of Pain, 1940. You've got 1942. You've got this preface to Paradise Lost. For those of you may not know, Paradise Lost is an epic poem by John Milton, written 1667. It's the sort of thing, if you study English literature, the history of it, you will spend a lot of time. Many a British student has cursed Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, sort of thing you have to study at school, like Shakespeare. Anyway, so there's a very much commented on, and Lewis wrote a comment. He was ultimately a professor of literature. So he's commenting on Paradise Lost. This is 42. It's 2 years after The Problem of Pain. And Paradise Lost is all about the fall of Adam and Eve. And in it, Adam and Eve are not savages. They are king and queen of the earth. They are very superior beings, highly intelligent, etc., which is more the biblical vision of Adam and Eve. So he says, I'd come to the podium, I associate innocence with childishness. and also an evolutionary background, which led me to think of early men, and therefore a fortiori of first men, as savages. So we just read that. Problem of pain. The beauty I expected in Adam and Eve was that of the primitive, the unsophisticated, the naive. The whole point about Adam and Eve is that, as they would have never, but for sin, have been old, they were never young, never immature or undeveloped. They were created full grown and perfect. So anyway, there you are. It does seem he's shifted his opinion between 40 and 42. He's not thinking about a sort of savage caveman anymore. He says, oh, well, I think it still is compatible with that picture I presented, but he's just saying that Adam and Eve, there they are, when God infuses that soul, they are highly intelligent and very in command of the situation. That's why, of course, they take over. By the time we get to Perilandra, that's the second of the cosmic trilogy, and he goes, and there's Adam and Eve on Venus. You know, they are very superior. Eve is the queen of Venus, and she is a very majestic queen. So anyway, where does Lewis fit into this whole picture? He obviously has interesting ideas, some of which are perhaps sort of ahead of his time. That's meant to be ideas. Perhaps they do change a bit. He's trying to marry his sort of evolutionary ideas with the biblical version. But there is this very clear distinction between spiritual man and material man. Perhaps it's helpful to understand animal intelligence. You know, obviously chimps do have a certain level of intelligence, dolphins and so on, but we're saying they're not spiritual beings. But it does seem to have no particular problem with the Homo sapiens emerging from primitive hominids. That's all I have to say. Hope it's helpful. I'll stop sharing. That's all from me.
Questions at the end. Now we are a bit late in time. Now, Theo, please.
Okay. So welcome to my presentation describing how and why Noah's flood may have occurred in the Neolithic. This was a period which lasted between the years of 10,000 BC to 2,300 BC, approximately. First, I'll quickly go over some justification for Adam and Eve living in the Neolithic. If this seems a bit familiar to you, it's probably because this content has cropped up in previous conferences. So Adam and Eve were the first biological creatures to be made in the image and likeness of God. We can assume that being in the image of God implies a purpose or meaning and comes with moral responsibility. This moral responsibility would perhaps show itself in the introduction of practical moral law and legal systems deriving from doctrinal religions. Since doctrinal religions originate in the Neolithic, around 2600 BC, Adam and Eve and the first humans in the image of God must have slightly preceded them, a reasonable date being around 3000 BC. Coincidentally, this date is also consistent with the dating of Adam and Eve using biblical ancestral lines and genealogies, such as that given in Luke's Gospel and Genesis. Furthermore, at the very least, a Neolithic Adam and Eve is still preferable to theories dating them earlier, such as 160,000 years ago at the last genetic bottleneck. This is because, for one, Adam and Eve living in the Neolithic is the least ontologically committed option. By this, I mean that it has the potential to explain all the same things as other models, such as how we bear original sin, but with a smaller number of entities or parts, i.e., we don't have to posit that there are over 100,000 years of God-inspired humanity before the start of doctrinal religions. And two, humans in the image of God living in the Neolithic is common ground for all models of Adam and Eve, even earlier ones. Meanwhile, the belief that humans in the image of God existed before this is not universally shared. So hopefully that was a somewhat quick but successful way of showing that Adam and Eve may have existed in the Neolithic, and that if it turns out the theory is sound, it is actually preferable to other theories. So combining modern anthropology, church teaching, and Adam and Eve existing in the Neolithic gives rise to two challenges that we'll focus on today. Challenge one is what I'll be addressing for the remainder of my talk, and challenge two will be covered by Antoine directly after me. So one, how should we interpret the flood if Noah, as a descendant of Adam and Eve, also lived in the Neolithic? This can be split into two sub-questions. First, should we interpret Noah and the flood as actual parts of history, or are they figurative or poetic? And second, if they are actual parts of history, how does the flood fit in with modern geological and anthropological findings? For this, we need to give a viable description for what the flood could have been like. And the second challenge, which will be addressed by Antoine, is that if genetic studies have shown that there have been no universally common ancestors within the last 160,000 years, how did it happen that before the time of Jesus, all hominids are in the image and likeness of God and bear original sin? So that's following on from what Mark said about those different models. So the first part of the question I'll be addressing: should we interpret Noah and the flood as part of history? So here's a passage from Luke quoting Jesus. Just realized my thing is in the way. Okay. Apologies. Yeah. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so also it will be in the days of the Son of Man. People were eating, drinking, marrying, and being given in marriage up to the day of Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all. To pick out the relevant part for our current discussion, the days of Noah will be like, or of the same kind as, the days of the Son of Man. So if the days of Noah are poetic or figurative, so must be the second coming. However, the reality of the second coming of Christ is a core belief of Christians, upheld in the Catechism as well as the ancient and universally proclaimed creed. In order for the second coming to be part of reality, to be actual, so too must have been Noah and the flood. Therefore, it seems that Jesus taught that Noah was a real historical person who was righteous and saved from the flood through the ark, and all other humans, all other merely biological humans at that time perished in the flood. Okay. And to further evaluate New Testament conceptions of the flood, we can look at 2 Peter. So it's quite a long excerpt. If God did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others. If this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. Here, a divinely inspired Peter uses the actuality of the flood as evidence for God's righteousness. It seems this shows that the cornerstone of our church believed in a real flood. So we will therefore set aside any poetic or figurative interpretations of the flood for the remainder of this talk. So part 2 of the question I'll be addressing, how are we to fit a Neolithic flood that came and destroyed them all with anthropological and geological findings? We can distinguish between 2 different possibilities. Either the flood was global or the flood was local. So a global flood. This is the interpretation that the entire Earth's surface was literally submerged and all land creatures not on the ark were destroyed. It would have occurred approximately 3,000 to 2,600 years BC, 10 generations after Adam and Eve. Whilst a global flood is the most immediate interpretation, it runs into serious problems. For one, a global flood would have caused a genetic bottleneck in humans. However, as previously stated in my talk and in previous talks, the last genetic bottleneck in humans is estimated to be over 100,000 years ago. Thus, a global flood conflicts with anthropology. Second, all the diversity of land animals we see today could not have developed from pairs of each species on the ark 5,000 years ago. And there is no way that the ark could have contained every single subspecies of every single species. Finally, due to the lack of evidence, a global flood within the last 5,000 years goes against geological findings. But what about a local flood? So given Adam and Eve were historical figures who existed in the Neolithic, it follows that by the time of Noah, there would have been a large community or communities of Adam and Eve's descendants who, like Adam and Eve, were in the image of God. This leads on to the possibility that flooding occurred only within this area, where all humans in the image of God lived, and thus the flood destroyed all true humans. Meanwhile, merely biological humans, not descended from Adam and Eve, throughout the rest of the world, were unaffected. This explanation does not entail that there be a genetic bottleneck in Neolithic humans, and so fits with anthropology. Similarly, only animals in that area need to be on Noah's Ark, thus the diversity of land animals we see today makes sense. And lastly, there seems to be geological findings that are consistent with such a local flood, which we'll look at now. It is posited that Adam and Eve existed in ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. Thus, it is sensible to look for evidence for large local flooding in the region of Mesopotamia in the Neolithic. The first piece of evidence is not from geology, but from literature. Many ancient Babylonian tales feature a great flood, most famously the Epic of Gilgamesh. This widespread mentioning makes it very likely that such a flood could have occurred. Now, from a geological point of view, it is apparent that Mesopotamia has the right conditions for large and slow draining floods, fitting with the description of the flood in Genesis. Further, there is actual evidence for flooding in this area ranging from 3,500 BC to 2,500 BC. One such study is from MacDonald, but I've heard of other earlier and more controversial studies affirming these findings. So I'm not a geologist, and so I really cannot comment on the reliability of these studies. So without wishing to mislead you, I would say that such findings of large local floods in ancient Mesopotamia are inconclusive, but very promising for the model of Adam and Eve and Noah in the Neolithic. So to conclude, it is reasonable to hold that Adam and Eve existed as individuals representative of a group in the Neolithic. Hence, there would have been an initial population of humans in the image of God amongst a global population of Homo sapiens. If this was the case, an actual local flood appears to be the only option that is consistent with scientific findings and with church teachings. And as Antoine will justify in his presentation, not only is a local flood a valid account, but it is the most insightful interpretation with regards to explaining the second challenge, which was, given there is no such genetic bottleneck within the last 160,000 years, how did it happen that before the time of Jesus, all hominids are in the image and likeness of God and bear original sin? So now over to you, Antoine.
Thank you, Theo.
Thank you for listening.
I will try to share my screen. So the flood as a new creation of humanity. The flood narrative refers to an event that happens after or alongside the following developments and achievements: rising of livestock, building of cities, manufacturing instruments and pipes, forging tools of bronze and iron, wine culture, awareness of sinful behavior, accountability toward God, and also penal law accountability toward humankind. In particular, the prohibition of murder in Genesis 9:3-5-6 recalls the mechanism Dunbar refers to as the centerpieces of the Neolithic, because they allowed people to live together without killing each other. And the awareness of sinful behavior, of capability to sin, as it appears in Genesis 3-6, fits better to post-agricultural Neolithic societies with, I quote Dunbar, high gods who can oversee the behavior of community members and have also a moral code important now, justified by religious principles. It is, according to Dunbar, characteristic of the doctrinal religions in the Neolithic and fits very well with the image we get from Genesis. So according to all this data in Genesis, the flood should be supposed to happen at the end of the Neolithic and affect some cradle of civilization. This would date the flood around 5000 BP. The book of Genesis, and in particular the flood narrative, have undoubtedly allegorical character. But as Christians, we are required to acknowledge as historical facts in Genesis those referred to in the New Testament as part of Jesus Christ's teaching about reaching eternal life, eternal salvation. And this teaching of Jesus Christ and of the Apostle Saint Peter is what Theo has presented and referred to. According to this teaching, I think it is we have to acknowledge that all humans ordered to eternal life and thus accountable toward God and capable of sinning, except Noah and his family, became corrupt and perished in the flood. So this is the teaching we find in Jesus Christ and in Saint Peter. So at this date of about 5000 BP, before present, the estimate of the Homo sapiens population all over the world is several million. Nothing speaks against assuming that at this moment Homo sapiens does not equate with humankind in the image of God at this moment. Important point, there is no evidence that a flood have wiped out 10 to 40 million people to a bottleneck of 8 persons. There are some bottlenecks described or hypothesized in the literature. An important one is a bottleneck about 5,000 to 7,000 before present across several old world populations, but this bottleneck is specific to human males. It is considered that human males have killed each other for infightings of tribes of different communities, and there have been this bottleneck. Nonetheless, at the time of this bottleneck, there was a large population of Homo sapiens, surely larger than 8 individuals. Other two bottlenecks described in the scientific papers is the bottleneck regarding to out of Africa about 50,000 years ago, and the bottleneck referring to Bering immigration to colonize the Americas about 30,000, 20,000 years ago. This means that you can well describe the genetic diversity with relation to Africa is lower outside Africa, and the genetic diversity in America is lower than the genetic diversity in these regions. So, but by this kind of bottlenecks, you can go to partial bottlenecks, but even though involving thousands or hundreds of individuals. Computational population genetics likely rolls out a strong bottleneck back to 8 persons in the last 180 years for today's human population. Here there is only a calculation by an expert, Joshua Swamidass, but there is no extensive literature about this result. How to fit this data to a coherent picture? I propose here an explanation based on 2 main assumptions. Well, Catastrophic floods with death tolls of hundreds of thousands are rather common. You have here a list of them. In 2004, tsunami killed 230,000 people. So the assumption one could be that the population killed in the Genesis flood was of this magnitude and represented all human beings, all human persons living at this moment on the earth. And the assumption too is that the rest of the 13 million Homo sapiens were made by God to humankind in the image of God at the end of the flood, the moment when God proclaims the universal prohibition of murder in Genesis by about 5,000 before present. These millions of people were made in the image of God the same way as God made the first human beings, say Adam and Eve. At the very beginning, as referred to in Genesis, that is, without intervention of other human persons. However, and that is the important point, since they were created after the first human sin, after the first sin in human history, contrarily to Adam and Eve, they were not created in the state of original righteousness. They were lacking the original grace Adam and Eve had. So, the flood as a new creation of humanity, using this sketch by Mark Fox, you can say at the beginning you have human animals, Homo sapiens animals. At a certain moment, God transformed one couple of human animals into persons, Adam and Eve. This God could also have transformed other people after the first two in human persons, so that you have a little community at the beginning already without problems with incest. It is important that to see that, well, they could have marriage between this and these two. The issue is that at the moment, the model assumes that at the moment of marriage, before getting married, before these guys getting living in the community with these friends, they were transformed by God into persons, like we have seen. There is original sin, and original sin could have happened in this community, and you can make the hypothesis also that some of them did not sin. So I think it would be an interesting question for mitochondrial Eva to ask what would have happened if mitochondrial Eva had not sinned. In any case, I will shortly say that it is speculation, but those who did not sin could have been taken into heaven directly by God, so that on the earth remain only people in need of redemption. And at the end of the flood, God transformed all people, all Homo sapiens on earth in the image of God. That is, all Homo sapiens became called to eternal life. Notice that also, but they were created by God in the state of original sin, like it happens today, around 400,000 every year, every day, 140 million of humans every year come into existence, and we believe they are conceived in the state of original sin. The explanation I am giving fits well to revelation and is not discarded by science. There could be a first couple of human persons at the moment when Homo sapiens was already a large population living everywhere. And the flood could wipe out the first human civilization of 8 persons to 8 persons without reducing the genetic pool of the species to a number which population genetics refutes. Let me say that this idea of the possibility that original sin happens in the moment when a human person is created and is not necessarily related to genetic inheritance. This is an idea that Joseph Ratzinger and also later as Pope Benedict develops as the idea original sin as relational damage. And if you see, he brings this idea that this transmission, this propagation or transmission of original sin is not necessarily related to genetic inheritance. Also important here, this refers to the talk by Mark Fox about Louis. This important quotation from Pius XII in Humani Genesis: God can create intelligent beings without ordering and calling them to the beatific vision. Conclusion is that at the end of the flood, God definitely recreates or new creates the humankind by making Homo sapiens totally into a population of human beings accountable to God. And by proclaiming and universally revealing this prohibition of homicide in Genesis, that is, writing this prohibition on the heart of each human being, God highlights that God loves humans and wants that the humans love and respect each other. And from this moment till today, all peoples on earth share in the dignity of being in the image of God and are called to eternal life. No matter whether they write or not, whether they make art or not, whether they are conscious or not, that is what this, I think, important prohibition, or you say, moral declaration of Genesis 9:5-6 means. That is the end. We have now some time to discuss and and compare the different models we have presented. So there is a lot of things to think about for the coming months and even years. So let us go to discussion. Who wants?
Sam's got his hand up, Antoine.
Please. Yes, Sam, go ahead.
Yes, I am wondering, it seems in all the models we're making, we're assuming that humanity kind of pops into being, but I'm not sure why that has to be. Why can it not grow into a humanity? Things come into being, maybe not pop into being. So why can't humanity, right, grow, like the organism we'd call human, right, grow into its humanity? Why does it have to be instantaneous at some particular point in time? Just as we wouldn't say a child becomes an adult at one point in time, at some point it just is an adult, but there's no specific point at which you can say it magically became an adult.
Well, so is someone who
this was mainly in response to Mark, what he said.
So for me, I would like this would speak in the sense, I fully accept your graduality, what you say, for if you want the biological basis, and even the moral basis, and even the religious basis, as, for instance, you can assume a certain continuity of progress in religious beliefs from animism to doctrinal religions. But what is instantaneous is the call of God. This is instantaneous. There is a moment, that is, as I see things, there is a moment when God called and ordered you to beatific vision, that is, to eternal life. And this is actually what defines you as human. That is my position. And very much in agreement with Pius XII.
It was also stating, Antoine, I mean, if you say, well, there's a gradual becoming a human, well, that's, if you start saying that, you've got real big problems. You know, we say you're an embryo as soon as it's conceived is a human person with rights we must defend. Obviously, people who support the abortion picture say, well, that isn't really a human person, and therefore we can kill them without any guilt.
That is exactly. That is what I refer to this point of Genesis 9:5-6 as the new creation of humanity. At this moment, all Homo sapiens creatures are called to be in the image of God and are called to eternal life. This means that this moment marks when the visible and observable sin of being in the image of God is the belonging to the species Homo sapiens. Since this moment, because actually before you cannot distinctly define Homo sapiens biologically. So it is in this moment when God calls the first human beings, Adam and Eve, or the first one, to calls and orders them to eternal life. Then, since this moment, there is the equality between Homo sapiens and humankind in the image of God. By this call, God defines humankind in the image of God.
I would like to make a statement, if it's allowed. There's a philosophical lemma that says, agere sequitur esse. That means the behavior has its ontological fundament. If we see certain things in human beings which exceed the capacity of the laws of physics and biology, then there should be a different basis. And this basis is that you have also spiritual aspects in human beings. For these spiritual aspects, you can see, for example, Ada spoke about that, mathematics and many other things, the burial is kind of expression of something which transcends the pure biological properties of an animal. And now what I'm saying, if you say that people get this, become human beings by just about few thousand years ago, what do you do? What is the ontological basis from the animals, human beings before that, where you clearly see there's something different from pure biological things? What I'm saying, but that was also what Sam was asking, the graduality. There's growth, of course, but having a non-physical or non-biological cause of aspect in a being is not gradual. Either you have it or you have it not. That, I think, is a strong difference between an animal and a person. Then you can make theologies ever after, but first you should be clarify what is really going on, what kind of animals or human beings are transformed in children of God.
Yeah.
I say what I will say, let's do a little bit more philosophy, metaphysics, instead of bringing in the revelation and theology. Because we have to argument with people who accept at least philosophy, but theology, you see that it's very difficult to find consensus in an academic discussion.
Well, Joe Evans and then Sam, please.
Thank you. I tend also to support Alfred there. Can I just a quick clarification, which probably shows my ignorance more than anything else? One thing I was a bit confused by, sometimes people spoke about Homo sapiens as rational, but then other times they made a distinction between Homo sapiens and humans. Is there something there I don't understand? As if humans was a later stage than Homo sapiens.
You are asking to me?
Yeah, anybody who can answer that question.
Okay.
No.
Well,
Homo sapiens is already quite long years ago, and therefore people sometimes say Homo sapiens, sapiens, to say what is in modern humans. And so in that sense, also Neanderthal belongs to Homo sapiens. The biological or paleontology is using that term. So, but therefore I prefer to speak about human persons, then it's clear that it exceeds the animal realm, that you're really going beyond.
Okay, thank you.
well, I would like, Joy, I would like to add that Homo sapiens, from a biological point of view, it is a fuzzy category. So it is sharply defined today in the current situation. And then you have to say when begins this current situation. Today, the species are distinct. But if you go back in time, in history, Homo sapiens becomes a very fuzzy concept. And you cannot, it comes a time where you have different groups in Africa, and you cannot state clear which is the best fitting as ancestor of Homo sapiens. So if you take Homo sapiens only as biological and genetic criterion, then you cannot define clearly and sharply humankind. So that is, I think, there is a difference in the sense that there was a time where Homo sapiens was not humankind in the image of God. And we are, that is what we are struggling with, is at which moment it is fitting to accept that this happened. And that, you see, that is the point. But it is clear there is a difference in history. But after this moment, when God calls all Homo sapiens into the image of God, after then it is the same. And in the current situation, it's the same. So that you can define the human person by the belonging to the species Homo sapiens today, and since this moment when God called Homo sapiens to the eternal life.
Perhaps I can say that I think I was a bit loose in my language. I'll tighten it. So I shall distinguish between humans and advanced chimpanzees.
Okay.
And Lewis, he says, you know, your definition of an advanced chimpanzee, he gave it hands whose thumbs could be applied to each of the fingers, jaws and teeth and throat capable of articulation, and the brain sufficiently complex to execute all of the material motions whereby rational thought is incarnated. But it was only an animal because all its physical and psychical processes were directed to purely material and natural ends. That's what old Jack Lewis says.
He's clearer than the distinction between human and Homo sapiens. That he makes
Okay.
sense. It's the other
I say human and advanced chimpanzee.
that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Distinction.
Can I just make a couple of comments? One, I do find Antoine's idea of God creating sinful human beings after the flood is a bit problematic from a theological point of view. Obviously, God does now create souls. Again, speaking as a believing Christian, God does now create souls which have sin. But you're positing there that at least there's also some sort of human involvement there. What you're positing is zero human involvement, which is theologically problematic in that it's somehow you're suggesting that God creates evil. I'll just leave that there. And we can then, following what Alfred said, I do think we do need to go to philosophy also because I think we don't really, and I'm the first person not to be an expert, we don't really have the biblical experts to deal with these questions. We really do need an expert on Genesis, one of these top scholars who knows what he's talking about. Because we're talking about Genesis and none of us really know what the state-of-the-art biblical discussions on Genesis are. So I think that we're a bit hindered there. I'm surprised nobody mentioned Cain. Genesis 4:14. Everybody who sees me will kill me. I mean, I think you all know it, but I'm surprised nobody actually talked about it because that's another biblical data to throw into the pot. And the last thing is that Theo's use of 1 Peter 3:19. It's a bit problematic because that text isn't just about Noah, it's also about Christ going to prison to visit the souls in prison. You don't quite know what's going on there.
Yes,
I think that one has to be a little bit careful to use that text.
Yes.
Okay.
They're just sort of picking out proof texts that suit our needs without necessarily analysing in their full depths and what are they actually saying.
Sure. Well, I think we can continue discussing, but it is time. And we can conclude, but there is many thanks for all this stimulating discussion. I think we have to take all these comments and each of us will reflect on this. Probably we should organize only one meeting to discuss more in depth each of these questions. So I would like now to make a very short conclusive remarks. We are here. So I think we all agree that if God made humankind in the image of God, since this moment, Homo sapiens is no longer a mere evolving biological species, but becomes a community of persons called to live and behave respecting each other according to moral rules and human rights. I think all the presented models agree in that by non-biological and non-physical causes, two individuals amid a large population of Homo sapiens became human persons. Around 150,000 years ago in the model mitochondrial Eve, about 40,000 years ago in the model taking variables as discerning criterion, and about 5,300 years ago, according to the model taking evidence for moral and legal accountability. I think there is also agreement in assuming Homo sapiens families originating from unions between biological descendants and non-descendants of Adam and Eve. There is disagreement regarding the personal nature of the parents. In the model, as I see mitochondrial Eve, one of the parents may be not a person. In the model, assuming moral responsibility and accountability and call to eternal life, both parents are called to eternal life, are persons. I think also that all these models we have discussed acknowledge that after the sin of Adam and Eve, each human person comes into existence in the state of original sin. This is, I think, is common to all models. So I think it is important, it is particularly interesting with relation to this proposal of God transforming all Homo sapiens on earth into human persons at the end of the flood, this idea of relational damage by Joseph Ratzinger. That is, it is the idea of disentangling original sin from genetic inheritance. Well, I can announce already the next meeting. It will be on Friday, 7th January 2022, because Saturday seems it doesn't fit well for many people, in particular for Ilias Khan and Anna Pearson, and who are supposed to present here. And we will focus here a bit on the second issue of reducing humans to machines. Can we distinguish humans from machines without referring to the call to eternal life? This is, I think, the important question we have to debate. And the time will be in the evening. So let us see whether this time is more convenient than Saturday. There is also the problem that the 2nd January is on Sunday. And so this could be a good time for most of the people. Then I say, we will develop this idea presented by Ilias and Anna Pearson on artificial intelligence, quantum computers, humanity, and the image of God. And there is already a presentation by André Rubia, who is a professor at the ETH Zurich, expert in exotic matter and neutrino physics. And that is all for today. I thank you again for your commitment and for your participation, and let us go ahead with this really interesting and stimulating work. So we can close here, and if you have still something you want to comment, otherwise we can see us in January. Okay. Well,
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to you all.